Right, welcome to another ILIG Informal. My name's Ian Stringer, Chair of ILIG. With a small but very select audience today, people come from corners of the globe, Sri Lanka and India to name a few. Many people meeting old colleagues, me included. Today, very appropriately for an international gathering. Oh, this is the international gathering, here comes another one. We've got Stephan who's going to talk about British Council, but I usually let my speakers tell you themselves rather than being like a hash of it. So over to you, Stephan. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ian. Okay, well, good evening, everybody, and very nice to be here and see you all, and thanks for making the effort to come tonight. And also, I see in the audience a number of friends and former colleagues and so forth, so it's great to see you all here. And Sarah Pink, who is currently working with the British Council in India, has also joined us, and will say some words at the end about what's currently happening with the British Council in terms of libraries. Because as you see, I take it up to 2016, and you may be wondering why in 2018. Well, I retired in 2016, so I feel that's as legitimate as I can be. So Sarah will take up thereafter, I think. And of course, IU, very nice to have you with us as well. And I was very much involved with the revival of our libraries in the British Council latterly. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today, just a few words about myself actually before we go any further. I was in the British Council for most of my career. I actually began life in public libraries. I did my Masters at Sheffield University, and then I worked for Coventry City Libraries for 4 or 5 years. And then I decided I fancied a sort of bit of time overseas, so I applied for the British Council at that time, and got in and got posted on my first posting to Sudan. And I worked then in a variety of countries. I worked in Saudi Arabia and later on Indonesia. Then I came back to headquarters, and I eventually became Director of Libraries and Information Services for the British Council at a point in time when the whole transition was happening to digital. Internet had come in and so forth. So it was a very interesting time actually to be there. And Valerie, you were there at the same point in time. So a lot of debate went on, which I'll take you through. Thereafter, I became the regional director for the British Council in Southeastern Europe, just after Milosevic had fallen from power. So I went into the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia, all those countries. And then I was put into a position as regional director for Europe. My final post was South Asia, regional director for South Asia, and that's when I got involved again, full circle, and I was able in that role to begin the revival of libraries in the British Council. It's quite a long story, but I'll take you through it. What I want to focus on is the Council's role, British Council's role in supporting libraries under pressure. I think we all agree in today's world with lots of fake news around and all kinds of other things, the role of authentic information and the role of libraries is probably more important than ever. Okay, so what is the British Council? I mean, most of you, I think, are aware of it, worked with it in a variety of roles. Basically, it's an organisation to promote Britain's cultural and educational relations with other countries. It's part funded by the UK government, but only currently, I think, at about sort of 17% of its total turnover. Its total turnover is around about £1 billion, but of that about 100 and something comes from the government. The rest is earned in different ways, either through language teaching or through contracts and so forth. That has had an effect, of course, in changing the culture of the British Council to some degree, and for good perhaps, or for bad. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. But it is now probably the most significant cultural relations organisation globally. Probably the only rival, in a sense, to it is the Goethe Institute. The United States suppressed its equivalent to the British Council about 15, 20 years ago when it absorbed the United States Information Service. But pretty well every country now has something equivalent. Chinese have the Confucius Centres, the Russians have the Pushkin Centres, and so on. But I think the British Council stands still as one of those organisations, which is probably a leader in that field of cultural relations. So, began in 1934 and it was established to promote the values of the UK as an open and democratic society. And its primary areas then were English language, arts, education, and so on, exactly the same areas as today. And the values that shaped the British Council were rooted originally in an opposition to Nazism and overt government propaganda. So these are some quotes. Now, I think these are very important and significant in terms of how we look at propaganda and how the present government uses, in a sense, cultural relations, because I think we're moving to a much more overt kind of use of cultural relations than was the case originally. This is a quote from Harold Nicholson, who was very influential. He said in the House of Commons, "During the last war, we lied damnably." I think of a few wars where we've lied damnably, but anyway. I think that some of our lies have done us tremendous harm, and I should not like to see such propaganda again. And this is one of the sort of root values of the British Council. And then you can see here, I think, which is the fundamental philosophy of the organisation. We'll need an organisation to conduct British cultural relations with other countries on the basis of reciprocity, sending out British speakers abroad, bringing foreign speakers. Now, this is very significant. It may look a bit old-fashioned, that language. What it's actually saying is culture is a two-way road, and we've got to listen as much as we've got to tell other people. Now, you know, you think this is the time when the British Empire is at its height in many ways, but you know, the value of the council was felt to be in listening and respecting others, other cultures. So at the same time as the British Council was launched, the Nazis were very involved in promoting soft power and culture. This is an example of Nazi propaganda at that time promoted by their cultural organisations. That one showing how the Americans and by implication the British are imposing their terror, their culture terror on the world. This one showing about England, you know, riding on the back of all the sort of colonial natives and saying, you know, England's burden, it says, with the Englishman riding on the top. And this one, an idyllic portrait of a German maiden, you know, to indicate the purity of the German culture and identities. This may look rather sort of brash and brutish, but at that time it had an enormous impact in many countries that were neutral. The Germans were really promoting their vision of culture in a way that threatened Western democracies, which is one of the reasons the British Council was established. So this was British propaganda in response. You know, we of the West riding, and history of the English language, and, you know, Pimpernel Smith, which was an extraordinarily successful film, actually, in gently mocking the Nazis and all that. So, you know, the British approach was very different. It was trying to take a low-key approach, you know, sort of build trust through different means, not so bombastically as the Germans were. So, in that period, World War II and its aftermath, the British Council by 1939 had got offices in quite a number of countries, Romania, Austria, Poland, and so forth. These were all countries chosen deliberately because they were countries where the Germans were trying to increase their influence. And during the Second World War, it played an important, if somewhat underestimated role. I mean, I think there were a lot of films at that time of bumbling professors and all kinds of things, you know, showing that low-key. But it did counter the spread of Nazi and fascist ideologies in countries like Portugal, Spain, Argentina, and so on, and Romania before they joined the Axis. Obviously, resources were limited for that kind of work, but there was an attempt to keep open a sense of free expression of ideas. That's why libraries were so critical to the British Council in those early days, because libraries were places where you could demonstrate free access to ideas. There was no censorship, you know, in that sense. So compared to the German cultural centres, which did have libraries as well, you know, the British Council ones had a whole range of opinions, and that was intended subtly to indicate the difference in values between the two countries. So, two facts from that period. Olivia Manning, I think probably who wrote the Balkan Trilogy, she describes very vividly the attack by the Iron Guard on the British Council Library in Bucharest, when books were scattered everywhere through the streets and so forth. And one of the characters says you can destroy books and libraries, but you can never destroy the ideals of free expression that they represent. And then, of course, Leslie Howard, the famous film actor, is a very strong supporter of the British Council during the war, and he was killed when his plane was shot down in 1943, returning from a British Council tour in Spain and Portugal. Flight 777 has caused a lot of one of those big mysteries. Why was he shot down? And, one of the things they say is that Goebbels was so incensed by the way he kind of represented through his films and all that kind of stuff, that free ideal, free expression that Britain was representing in the world, that his plane was targeted deliberately, although it was in a neutral zone. There's the sort of one of the British Council centres. I think that one's in Liverpool, and it was for people from all the Allied countries who were fighting with Britain to come and use that centre, use the library there, and so on. And very important it was too for many of those people from those countries. So after the war, there was a period when British Council libraries were opened up right across Central and Eastern Europe immediately after the war. But most of these, and amongst those was the whole initiative in Germany, Die Brücken, which was a very big success in bringing reconciliation between Britain and Germany, providing libraries in every German city. But most of those in East and Central Europe were closed down as the communists seized power. The only two countries who held out against that were Poland and Yugoslavia at that time, who despite the pressures from the Soviet Union, said that they wanted to keep British Council libraries. And that was the case right the way through till the fall of communism in 1989. I think what began to happen at this period in history is that there was a sort of global, you might say, struggle happening between the Soviet Union and the Western world in one form or another, which went global, went to Africa, to Asia, and so on. So there's a struggle for influence between rival ideologies. So this period was huge expansion for the British Council and for libraries, particularly in countries of Africa and Asia and so on. And open access to ideas and knowledge was central to the mission. So libraries were central to the mission at this point. There were over 200 libraries in existence around the world, many of them in countries like India and Pakistan and so on. At its peak in '82, global library membership was over 1 million, and Mumbai was the busiest library in the British Council network at that time. So this was a very vibrant period for British Council libraries because they were seen as a real arm of the struggle against Soviet ideologies and things like that in those sorts of countries. Of course, you can always have the debate, how far was the British Council still an arm of colonialism in promoting sort of particular ideas and values in post-colonial environments and so on. And doubtless, that could be said in some countries to have been the case still, because it catered to a colonial elite to some degree. But these were times of change, and by and large, the British Council libraries, and from my experience, because that's when I sort of joined the council, and I'm sure Valerie and others, Sylvia and so forth, who knew our libraries at that time, these were very valued by people in those countries. Often the only point where you could go and get books in English for either free or for a very small charge, because there just wasn't the kind of library networks. There were some, but they struggled in many of these countries. That was the British Council in India, I think in Delhi or something, Mumbai, at some point in the 60s. Classic sort of scene with all the students, they're hard at work and I mean, in many ways, the British Council became the local public libraries. That was the interesting thing. So that when attempts were made to close British Council libraries in countries like India, even recently in the last 10 years, there were major demonstrations. People felt they were losing their local library. In fact, one of the British Council directors, his effigy was carried and burnt in the streets when he tried to close the library in a particular Indian city. So, many directors had that. had that profile. Alongside running the libraries, I mean, that British Council never felt that was enough, just to run our own libraries. It was important to invest in and develop national and local library systems, particularly university, special and public libraries in those countries. And this has had a lasting impact. I mean, there was a major investment in national and public library systems and university library systems right from the 60s onwards. And then there were, British Council's library work and development work was seen as absolutely integral to the UK government's educational aid and technical assistance programmes. So this was a period when, in addition to what the council could do with its own libraries, we were getting a lot of money from DFID, ODA as it was then, to help develop libraries, help develop publishing and so on. An example is Evelyn Evans. She was one of the great sort of figures of the British Council library world, and she became advisor to the Ghanaian government and helped develop a whole network of public libraries in Ghana at that time. And you can see the forward is by none other than President Nkrumah, which shows the kind of esteem, I suppose, in which people like Evelyn were held, at that time and appreciated for what they were doing. So over that 20-year period, as I've mentioned, there was a lot of funding for the UK's Overseas Development Administration, support libraries and publishing. And these are a range of programmes which were run at that time. The Library Development Scheme, which helped fund the development of libraries in Africa and Asia. Book Presentation Scheme, whereby enormous numbers of books were presented to libraries. Publishing Development Programmes, support local publishers. And 10,000 libraries in over 40 countries benefited in this period from these programmes. And, Library Association, lots of UK libraries, publishers were all involved, book suppliers were all involved in these programmes at the time. It was a very major initiative by the UK at that time to strengthen libraries as vehicles for sort of information access and for where people could actually, go and find real news, real information, and so on in those countries. That's an example of one of that's Singapore, I think, which the British Council had a role in helping develop at that time. And of course, the British Council, as I said, couldn't do any of this on its own, and very strong partnerships at that time. And we had, British Council at that time had Publishers Advisory Committee and a Libraries Advisory Committee, and with leading figures from both the publishing and libraries world involved in it. It was, a very major area of council activity throughout all those years. And these committees were hugely important to plug the British Council into the wider library information world and publishing world in the UK. And there was also very strong partnerships with IFLA and the European Commission, World Bank, ODA, in all those areas. So, collapse of the Soviet Union in the Soviet system enabled the council to return. And, this was a huge expansion through the 90s in East and Central Europe. And the British Council libraries opened in every country, reopened in every country. However, the internet had arrived in the mid-90s. And I think this was the peak of British Council libraries. At this point, when the internet arrived, there were new challenges, and I think all libraries were going through this. How do you balance digital and print, bricks and clicks? There were lots of debates. Should we close our libraries? And we had an attempt to close some libraries in Europe, which provoked a big uproar actually at the time, led by an organisation called the Concerned English Speakers of Athens, CESA, which somehow got mainstreamed into the UK press. So we had every conceivable author, writer talking about the British Council and why was it closing libraries, etc., etc. These were small libraries in effect, and many of them already had been partly made redundant because most of these countries had pretty good libraries of their own, but still that affection was there for the British Council Library. So at the time, I personally had to lead an inquiry into the closure of our libraries in Europe, and why this was happening at what point, and recommend in certain countries that we reverse that, because clearly it was getting us so much negative press and publicity and so forth. But I think it was a flavour. We knew we were up against change, and this change was, important for the council as it was for the rest of the. At that point, we came in very involved with the World Bank and so forth in developing the Global Knowledge Partnership, which was addressing the whole digital divide globally. That was the big Knowledge Partnership conference in Malaysia. The Malaysians issued stamps in support. I mean, this, in a way, in sense, the world was changing around us. So, what happened? Well, there was over a 9-year period widespread closure of British Council libraries and library development programs in response to the digital revolution. And this was a loss of space, loss of accessible space open to everyone. And I do think this was a big mistake. I had left libraries by that time. It was my successor who had to grapple with all that, with the change in mood of the British Council. But I remember from where I was in Bucharest at the time, I was looking after our Balkan region, I was very distressed by the haphazard way in which this happened. There was no policy, no strategy. It was just like, oh, everything's digital now. We don't need libraries anymore. And the whole sort of concept and importance of libraries as convening spaces, safe spaces, as cultural spaces, and actually a place anybody can come into, was lost, I think, very quickly from the council, because a series of decisions were made at country level, not even at the level of our board or anything like that. Suddenly somebody woke up and said, oh, hold on, we've hardly got any libraries left. What's happened? Because I think the number of libraries went down from 200 to about 20 over a period of 9 years, 8 or 9 years. And I think this was, one of the biggest mistakes the council's probably made in its history, actually, in terms of undervaluing the importance of libraries and so forth at this point in UK's needs for cultural relations. However, never say die, and in 2012-2013, we launched a new library revolution program. And the aim of this is to fuse the best aspects of physical and digital library space and collections. Now, this program was launched in South Asia, because that's where I was director, so I was able to actually back it and say, and because the libraries in South Asia had never closed. They were the last bastions of the British Council Library Network, because the demand for them was so great still, and they were so well appreciated that no one had dared close them. No country, as I told you, mass burnings or effigies and things took place. So we had them, but we had recognised that they needed to change and adapt and so forth, and we would use South Asia as the sort of launch pad to redevelop libraries in other parts of the world, particularly Africa, particularly the Middle East, possibly. And we had a close working partnership. CILIP and Ayub and John were very, very much involved. And Sarah, who's here now, is now leading that particular program, so I'll be able to say quite a bit more about this after I finish where we currently are with the program. But the sense was, obviously we're not going to just keep the libraries as they were. I mean, the world has moved on, but it's about what does a library in today's world mean to people. Now, particularly in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, where there are a lot of pressures on people, difficulty of access and so on, we felt libraries had a real importance. So there's an example. So basically what this is about is, this is the example of the new library in Lahore. The library in Lahore was closed, I think, when was it closed? About 2000 and...
when the Twin Tower...
Oh, 2001,
yeah.
They closed it. But the view was that, Lahore, Pakistan was absolutely a place where Lahore is a very literate city. Lots of young people and so forth, a huge thirst for using, for books, for information, digital information, to come together. We decided to, and where CILIP and I were very involved, relaunch or reopen the library in Lahore. So it's a completely new library. It was reopened about 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago. And it's state of the art, has a lot of digital stuff, a lot of print material as well, but also it's a safe space that people can come into. This concept of a safe space in societies under pressure, I think, is really important in today's world, because if we were confronting the Nazis in the past, now we are dealing with other forms of oppression and restriction and terror in other countries. And so being able to give people, particularly young people, students and others, a place they can come where they know they can access material safely, where they can meet with other people, exchange ideas, learn new things, I think is a hugely important role for what the UK can do and offer in that. That's the game inside of the... So a far cry from the serried ranks of desks and other things that we used to have, all movable shelving and so forth, bright colours and so forth. Sarah will have said a bit more how these are all doing, and how you as well, how things are going. That's the British Council Library Colombo. We've got a colleague here from Sri Lanka, which again was totally refurbished as part of the Library Revolution programme. To update it and have, and you can see, actually thronged with lots of students, young people studying and so forth. Dhaka, the children's section in the British Council in Dhaka. Chennai in Madras. All these examples you see are South Asia, and this is because that's where the main investment has been going on. So those are just some final reflections that the contribution of libraries, both in their physical, I think that's important, and digital, for sustaining freedom of the human spirit can never be underestimated. And access to them is a universal right and benefit and needs to be respected, protected and promoted. This has been a guiding driver for the British Council over the last 8 years. And I'm particularly pleased that in today's age of increasing intolerance and misinformation and fake news, the British Council is, in a way, going back again to understanding the important role that libraries can play. Obviously, we're not going to probably open a library in somewhere like Paris or Berlin again. That's not necessary. But in those countries where information is difficult to get hold of, where it's expensive, where perhaps people feel intimidated even going in and trying to access information, where UK resources are prohibitively priced for them, the British Council still has a role to play in providing that kind of access. That's in Bangladesh, celebrating the National Library Day, the British Council's involvement there, the logo there. So thank you very much. That's roughly what I wanted to say. So I'm open to any questions or whatever on this.
Does Sarah want to have a word first and then ask questions?
Yes.
To go?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, so fascinating presentation, Stephan. Thank you for that. So my job is a new one, and it's only possible to have that role because of the work of my predecessor, Stephan, like yourself, and colleagues like Ayub. So I've been with the council for only 5 months. So I moved to Delhi in India on the 1st of May. And I'm delighted to say that there is no agenda in South Asia to close any of those libraries. So we have the 2 in Pakistan, 1 in Bangladesh, 3 in Sri Lanka, and 9 in India. So they kind of fall under my remit, and that's the physical library. But my job really, so I'm Director of Libraries and Digital Services for South Asia, and the main remit that I'm working under is to extend the digital services of the British Council to areas where they won't have a physical library. And that's just either because the infrastructure won't allow us to put a physical library in there, or because we can't afford to build a library when we didn't have one before. So it's about keeping the ones that we've got and making them better and bigger and more wonderful, but expanding our digital reach. So just last week, we were able to put the digital library into the British Council Centre in Kathmandu in Nepal. And now we're working quite closely with the University of Kabul in Afghanistan, and we hope that we'll be able to put the digital library there in January. So it's really about getting the best of UK content that we can license, but also British Council content, because we have huge collections of art and exam material and teaching resources that we haven't made available globally. And so in doing this job and finding all these different areas where we can grow our digital library, like Ayub was saying, we have found some secret libraries. So we found 3 British Council libraries in Romania that were hidden and now feel brave enough to say hi. 1 in Spain, 1 in Poland, and 1 in Portugal. So we're going to extend the digital library for British Council into those physical libraries now that we know that they're there. And we're also, with your help, Io, because you were in Zimbabwe really recently with us, I think. Also in Zimbabwe and Myanmar. So it's really all about, I think, recognising that we can't put a physical library everywhere. But I think on the back of all the work that Stephan, you have done, and all your colleagues, there is an awareness and a realisation that actually British Council was a shop window through its libraries and its information and its content. Let's continue to do that, but we need to do that probably in a different way, which is where the digital is coming through. So hopefully, only 5 months in, but hopefully we will be able to do that and to grow that reputation back as British Council being an organisation that really cares about its libraries.
Really great news to hear.
Well done, you.
Well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sarah, that's so nice.